Hello, I hope this story will make you think and keep you on your toes until the very end. Your feedback, suggestions, and subscriptions are always welcome. George loved the quiet of his mornings. At 75, he felt he deserved a quiet life after decades of hard work. He lived in a large house that he had once built with his own hands and considered himself lucky to have 2 grown children who visited him from time to time. But this day was different. George went to his son Paul's house to pick up a book he had borrowed. Paul worked as a financial advisor, and his office was always filled with papers. George started looking through the shelves for the book. He came across a drawer that was slightly ajar. Inside was a thick folder with his name on the cover. "What is this?" he muttered as he took it out. He opened it and saw a document that literally made his heart stop for a moment. It was a list of all his possessions in house, land, savings, even his old car. Next to each item were notes on who should get it. George could not believe his eyes. They're already dividing up my inheritance," he said aloud, feeling his hands shaking. His gaze lingered on a few lines. House, Melissa for rent. Savings, to be divided between Paul and Anna. Land, to be sold to pay off debts. George felt his heart sink. He put the file on the table and sat down in his chair, trying to calm down. Is this a joke? He thought, or is Paul just keeping records in case something happens? But deep down inside, he felt that this was more than just accounting. George began to remember the last few months. Paul and Anna had been visiting more often, although it had rarely happened before. Melissa, his daughter-in-law, kept hinting at the importance of planning for the future. Was this all part of the plan? He asked himself. When George got home, he felt his head spinning. He sat down on his favorite couch and looked a photo of his late wife for a long time. "What would you have done in my place, Margaret?" he whispered. He was filled with anger and frustration. He felt he had to act, but he didn't know where to start. George sat in his office, holding the folder he had found in Paul's house. His thoughts revolved around what he had read. But the more he thought, the more questions he had. George, a wealthy retirer who has worked hard all his life to provide for his family. His main values are honesty and trust. Paul, George's eldest son, a 45-year-old financial consultant. Ambitious, practical, and seems to be a bit cold in his relationship with his father. Anna, George's 35-year-old daughter, a single mother. She has always been closer to her father, but has rarely visited him lately. Melissa, Paul's wife, an active and powerful woman who often takes the lead in family affairs. Sarah, a lawyer and longtime friend of George's who has helped him with legal matters. The next morning, George decided to call Sarah. "Sarah, I need your help," he said. "It's about my inheritance." "What's wrong, George?" She asked. "I found some documents that have me worried. I think my family is hiding something," he replied. "Let's meet," Sarah suggested. Sarah arrived the same day. They sat down in the kitchen and George showed her the documents he had found. "This looks like a plan to divide your inheritance," she said after a brief glance. "But I'm still alive." George was indignant. It could be just preparation for the future," Sarah reassured him. "But I understand why you're worried." Sarah turned her attention to the notes on the document. "Look at these notes," she said. "They're in different handwritings." "That means more than one person worked on this," George suggested. "Yes, it does. And they don't seem to be just random notes," Sarah added. The next day, George decided to talk to Anna, hoping to get some answers. "Hi, Dad," she said when he called. "Anna, we need to meet," George said. They agreed to meet at a cafe. Anna looked a little nervous, but tried to stay calm. "What's wrong, Dad?" she asked. George put the documents on the table in front of her. "What is this?" he asked. Anna fell silent, her eyes widening. I don't know," she finally replied. "You don't know? Then why is your handwriting here?" he asked. Anna began to make excuses. "Dad, I don't know all the details," she said. "Paul said it was just preparation for the future. But why didn't I know anything about it? George insisted. Paul said it was best to discuss it later, Anna replied. George returned home with the feeling that the situation was much more complicated than he had thought. George couldn't sleep after talking to Anna. Her explanations were vague, and her nervous tone only made him more suspicious. He realized that if he wanted to find out the truth, he had to look for evidence himself. The next day, George went to Paul's house when he wasn't home. He didn't like going through his son's things, but he felt it was necessary. If they are hiding something from me, I have a right to know, he told himself. In Paul's office, in addition to the documents George had already seen, he found an electronic tablet left on the desk. George turned it on and started looking through the files. One of them contained notes that confirmed his worst fears. Asset allocation complete by the end of the year. Land in the suburbs appraisal for sale. Foundation in Paul and Melissa's naming to be set up after access is granted. George felt his heart clench. Onanasha, they don't even wait for me to die, he muttered. His anger was mixed with frustration. He could no longer ignore the obvious his family was going behind his back. When George returned home, he decided to talk to Melissa. He called her and asked to meet. Melissa, I found something in Paul's office, he began. Melissa was silent for a few seconds and then said, I think it's better if we talk in person. They met that evening. Melissa looked calm, but there was something wary in her eyes. George, I know you're worried, she said, but you've got the wrong idea. Misunderstood. George raised his voice. Then explain to me what this fund in your name is. It's just a preparation, she began. Paul wanted to make sure that everything would be okay if something happened. But I'm still alive, George replied, and I didn't agree to this. Melissa sighed. We thought it was best for everyone, she said. George sensed that Melissa was not telling the whole truth. Who else knows about this? He asked. Anna was involved, but she didn't know all the details, Melissa replied. After talking to Melissa, George was in no doubt his family was planning to divide his estate while he was still alive, and he felt betrayed and alone, but decided that he would not let them get away with it. George sat in his living room, holding the documents he had found. If they want to play these games, he said aloud, I'll show them who's boss. After talking to Melissa, George realized that he could not rely on his family's words. He felt that there was something more to their excuses. To find out the truth, George decided to act decisively. George turned to Sarah, his lawyer, who had already helped him sort through the documents. Sarah, I need your help, he said. What did you find out? She asked. George told her about the files he'd found on Paul's tablet and his conversation with Melissa. It's starting to look like a conspiracy, Sarah said, but we need hard evidence. Sarah suggested checking George's financial transactions to see if there had been any attempts to access his assets. I can contact your bank and see if there have been any suspicious transactions, she said. Do it, George replied. A few days later, Sarah returned with the news. Your accounts are clean, she said, but I found one interesting detail. Paul filed a request for your financial history. A request? Why? George was surprised. Maybe to evaluate your assets, Sarah suggested. George decided to talk to Anna again. He invited her to lunch, hoping that in a more relaxed atmosphere she would be more open. Anna, I want to know the truth, he said as they sat down to dinner. Dad, I've already told you everything I know, she replied. But you knew about Paul's plans, George insisted. Why didn't you stop him? Anna sighed. I thought he was doing everything for our good. She said, our good? What about me? George asked. Dad, I really didn't mean for it to go this far, Anna replied, avoiding his gaze. George decided to contact a friend at a real estate agency to see if there had been any requests for an appraisal of his property. George, did you know your land was appraised a few weeks ago? The agent asked. Appraised? Who did it? George asked. Paul's name was on the application. The agent replied. This information confirmed his suspicions. That evening, George decided to meet with Paul. Paul, I need to talk to you, he said on the phone. "Dad, I'm busy," Paul replied. "That's not a request," George said. When Paul arrived, George asked him directly, "Why did you appraise my land?" Paul hesitated. Dad, it's not what you think," he began. Then explain what it is," George insisted. Paul tried to explain himself, but George didn't believe him. "You didn't even try to talk to me," George said. "You went behind my back." Sirrah, Dad. I wanted to make sure you'd be okay if something happened to you," Paul replied. "But I'm still alive," George exclaimed. Paul was silent, not knowing what to say. George looked at him, feeling that the trust between them was broken. George began to suspect that the reason for his children's behavior might be financial difficulties. The lack of direct answers and their mysterious nature only confirmed these thoughts. George shared his suspicions with his lawyer. "Sarah, I think Paul and Anna are hiding serious financial problems," he said. That's possible," she replied. "We can check their financial records, but we need their consent." "I doubt they'll give it," George said. "Then we'll have to find other ways to find out the truth," Sarah added. That afternoon, Anna came to see George. She looked confused and a little upset. "Dad, I need to talk to you," she said. "What's wrong?" George asked. Anna sighed. "I'm having financial problems. I lost my job a few months ago, and now I'm trying to find a new one. But the debts are piling up, and I don't know how to handle it." George felt mixed emotions. On the one hand, he understood that Anna was going through a difficult time. And on the other hand, why didn't she tell him earlier? "Why didn't you say anything about it?" he asked. "I didn't want to worry you," Anna answered. "Paul said we could work it out on our own." "What about Paul?" George asked. "Is he having financial problems too?" Anna hesitated. I'm not sure, but he's often said that he's having trouble keeping up with expenses. His business is going through a rough patch," she said. Is that why he's thinking of selling my land?" George asked sharply. Anna did not answer, but her silence spoke volumes. George decided to verify Anna's story. He contacted a friend in the financial sector who had access to public records of Paul's business. "George, I don't know how to tell you this," the friend began, "but Paul is in serious debt. His company owes the bank over $200,000. George was shocked, and he didn't say a word to me, he said aloud. When George returned home, he sat in silence for a long time. He felt betrayed, but he also realized that his children may have been backed into a corner. They thought this was the only way out, he thought. George decided to talk to Melissa again, hoping to get more information. Did you know about Paul's debts? He asked. Melissa nodded. Yes, but he asked me not to interfere, she said. Paul was confident that he could find a way out, and his way out was to sell my land. George asked sarcastically. Melissa looked down. George realized that his children were in a difficult situation, but that did not justify their actions. George decided that it was time to put an end to the intrigue. He invited everyone, Paul, Anna, and Melissa, to dinner at his house. It was an opportunity to tell them all what he had learned and make them accountable for their actions. George had set the table, as always, with care and attention. But this time the atmosphere was tense. He could feel his anger boiling up inside him, but he decided to remain calm to get the whole truth out of them. And they need to explain their actions, he thought. When Paul, Anna, and Melissa sat down at the table, George began to speak. I invited you here because I want to know the truth, he said. The three of them looked at each other. What are you talking about, Dad? Paul tried to smile. About your plans to divide my estate while I'm still alive, George replied sharply. Dad, it's not like you think, Anna began. What do you mean then? George asked. I found the documents you all drafted together. I know about Paul's debts and your financial difficulties, Anna. And I know that Melissa was involved in it, too. Amma, we didn't mean to hurt you, Melissa interjected. We were just thinking about the future. The future? George raised his voice. You thought about your future, but not about me. You didn't even consult me. Paul sighed and confessing, Dad, I was really in a lot of debt. I didn't see any other way out. Anna started to cry. I lost my job and was desperate. Paul convinced me that this was the best decision, she said. Paul just wanted to help all of us, Melissa said. We thought if we did it right, you wouldn't even know. George felt his heart clench. "Oh, you thought I wouldn't find out. Do you really have that little respect for me?" he asked. Paul lowered his head. "We were wrong," he said. George got up from the table and went to the window. He looked out at his garden and tried to find the right words. "I've worked my whole life to provide for you," he said, turning to them, "and this is how you repay me." Dad, we're going to do everything we can to make things right," Anna said. "But can you fix a betrayal?" George asked. George looked at his children and daughter-in-law, feeling that the trust between them had been shattered. After a tense dinner, George could not sleep. His heart was heavy with not only disappointment but also pain. He sat in his office, looking at old family photos, and thought about how things had come so far. One of the photos showed a young Paul holding a model airplane George had made for him. Another was of Anna smiling next to her mother in the garden. How could they have done this? George thought, but his heart told him otherwise. They were still his children, no matter what. The next morning, George met with Sarah. Sarah, I don't know what to do," he said. "I'm angry, but at the same time I want to help them." "George, only you can decide," she replied. "But remember that true strength lies in balancing justice and forgiveness." George decided to talk to Paul alone. They met in a cafe where they used to have coffee together. "Paul, I want to hear the whole truth from you," George began. But Paul looked guilty, but finally opened up. "Dad, I was really in debt. My business was failing, and I was afraid we were going to lose everything. I thought I could fix it if I got some time and money." And you thought I wouldn't understand?" George asked. I didn't want to worry you," Paul replied, "but I can see that it was a mistake." Anna came to see her father the next day. She looked tired but determined. Dad, I want you to know that I'm sorry for what happened," she said. "Paul convinced me that this was the only way." Why didn't you come to me sooner?" George asked. I thought you wouldn't understand," she replied, "but now I see that we were all wrong." George thought about his children's words for a long time. His anger gradually gave way to a mixture of compassion and a desire to find a solution. One evening he gathered the whole family in his house. "I've made a decision," he said as they sat down around the table. Everyone held their breath. I forgive you," he began, "but that doesn't mean I've forgotten everything you've done." We understand, Dad," Paul said. You have to earn my trust back," George added. "And to do that, I want us to work together to solve your problems." George offered to create a plan that would help Paul and Anna get out of their financial difficulties without selling his property. "But remember, this is your last chance," he said. Paul and Anna agreed. And George felt he had made the right choice.